Have you ever found yourself puzzled by someone's behaviour? That moment when you think, why would they do that? Or perhaps you've been mystified by your own reactions, a surge of irrational anger, an inexplicable attraction, a decision that, in retrospect, makes little sense. These moments aren't random glitches in the human experience, they're expressions of deeper patterns, what we might call the laws of human nature. These laws operate beneath the surface of our conscious awareness, shaping our decisions, relationships, and lives in ways we rarely fully comprehend. Today we're going to pull back the curtain on these hidden forces. We'll explore why humans behave as they do, how we can develop greater awareness of our own nature, and perhaps most importantly, how understanding these laws can transform our relationships and our lives. This isn't just academic knowledge. It's practical wisdom that has been observed across cultures and throughout human history. Whether we're examining ancient philosophical texts or the latest neuroscience research, the same patterns emerge again and again. Human nature may be complex, but it isn't random. It follows laws as consistent as gravity, though far more nuanced. So join me on this journey into the essence of what makes us human. By the end of our time together, you'll never look at yourself, or others, quite the same way again. Let's begin with perhaps the most fundamental law of human nature, what we might call the irrationality principle. This is the uncomfortable truth that humans are far less rational than we believe ourselves to be. We like to think of ourselves as logical beings who make reasoned decisions based on evidence and careful analysis. The reality is quite different. Our rational mind is more like a public relations representative for our emotional brain. It comes up with compelling justifications for decisions that were actually made by deeper, more primitive parts of our psyche. This isn't a flaw in our design, it's a feature. Our emotional reactions evolved to help us make rapid decisions in environments where hesitation could be fatal. Long before we developed the capacity for complex reasoning, we needed to know instantly whether to flee from danger or approach an opportunity. These ancient emotional systems still drive much of our behaviour today. The neurochemistry of attraction, fear, disgust, and desire shapes our choices in ways our conscious mind often fails to recognise. When we feel drawn to a charismatic leader, repulsed by a stranger's mannerisms, or inexplicably anxious in certain environments, we're experiencing these primal responses at work. What makes this principle particularly challenging is our profound self-deception about it. We consistently underestimate how much our emotions influence our thinking, and we overestimate our rationality, a cognitive bias psychologists call the introspection illusion. We see others being swayed by emotion while believing our own views are objectively rational. Consider how often political disagreements devolve into emotional exchanges rather than rational debate. Both sides believe they're being perfectly logical, while seeing the other as hopelessly biased. The irony is that both are likely being driven primarily by emotional reactions that their rational minds are busily justifying. This emotional foundation of human behaviour explains why pure logical argument rarely changes minds. When we try to persuade others through reason alone, we're addressing only the surface level of their thought process. The real drivers, identity, emotion, and unconscious bias, remain untouched. Understanding the irrationality principle doesn't mean abandoning reason. Rather, it means developing what philosophers have called the rational recognition of irrationality, acknowledging the emotional underpinnings of our thoughts so we can work with them, rather than being unconsciously controlled by them. This recognition can transform our approach to communication and influence. Instead of focusing exclusively on logical arguments, we learn to address the emotional foundations of belief. We recognize that facts don't speak for themselves, they speak through the filter of emotion and identity. Perhaps most importantly, embracing this principle allows us to be more forgiving of both ourselves and others. The next time you find yourself making an irrational decision or struggling to understand someone else's seemingly illogical behaviour, remember this fundamental law. Human nature begins with emotion, not reason. Now let's explore another fundamental law of human nature, the law of narcissism. This law states that all humans have an inherent self-centeredness that shapes how we perceive and interact with the world. To be clear, we're not talking about clinical narcissistic personality disorder, nor are we making a moral judgment about selfishness. This law refers to a basic psychological reality. We each experience the world from our own perspective, with ourselves at the centre. This narcissistic tendency manifests in countless ways. Think about the last time you were part of a group photograph. What was the first face you looked for when you saw the picture? Most likely your own. Or consider how easily we remember criticism directed at us while forgetting criticism we've directed at others. Our own experiences simply feel more real, more important, and more vivid than anyone else's. Even our perception of time is coloured by this narcissistic lens. Studies show that people consistently overestimate how much they contribute to group projects and underestimate others' contributions. We remember slights against us far more clearly than slights we inflict on others. Our minds naturally place our own perspectives, needs, and experiences at the centre of the narrative. What makes this law particularly challenging is that it operates largely outside our awareness. We don't consciously decide to prioritise our perspectives. Our brains do this automatically. And while we can easily spot narcissistic tendencies in others, we have remarkable blind spots when it comes to recognising our own self-centeredness. The implications of this law are profound. Much of human conflict stems from competing narcissisms, multiple people each believing their perspective is the objective truth. Political divides, relationship struggles, and workplace tensions often reflect not just different opinions, but different realities coloured by each person's narcissistic lens. Understanding this law doesn't mean we should resign ourselves to selfishness. Rather, it invites us to develop what psychologists call theory of mind, the capacity to recognise that others have perspectives, needs, and inner experiences as rich and valid as our own. This ability to step outside our narcissistic bubble represents one of the greatest achievements of human consciousness. In practical terms, acknowledging the law of narcissism means approaching conversations with the awareness that the other person is experiencing a reality centered on themselves, just as you are. It means recognizing that when someone seems insensitive to your needs, they may simply be caught in the gravitational pull of their own concerns, rather than deliberately ignoring yours. Perhaps most powerfully, understanding this law allows us to practice what might be called strategic decentering, the deliberate shift of attention away from ourselves and toward others. This isn't just an act of kindness, it's also remarkably effective for building influence. As Dale Carnegie observed long ago, becoming genuinely interested in others is far more persuasive than trying to make them interested in you. The paradox of the law of narcissism is that by acknowledging our inherent self-centeredness, we gain the capacity to transcend it, creating deeper connections and more effective relationships in the process. Let's now examine what we might call the law of role-playing, the reality that humans are natural actors, constantly performing various roles that may have little connection to our authentic selves. We often think of ourselves as having fixed, consistent identities, but psychological research consistently reveals how fluidly we adapt our behaviour to different social contexts. The person you are in a job interview differs from the person you are with close friends, who differs from the person you are with family, who differs from the person you are when completely alone. These aren't acts of deliberate deception. Rather, they reflect the inherently social nature of human consciousness. We evolved in tribal environments where social acceptance was literally a matter of survival. Our ancestors who could adapt their behaviour to meet group expectations lived to pass on their genes. Those who couldn't risked exile and death. This evolutionary history has left us exquisitely attuned to social expectations. We unconsciously absorb cues about how we should behave in different contexts and adjust our self-presentation accordingly. The corporate executive who projects unwavering confidence in the boardroom may be tender and vulnerable with a romantic partner, stern as a parent, and playfully childlike with old friends. None of these versions is necessarily more real than the others. They're all aspects of the same multifaceted human being. What's fascinating about the law of role-playing is how unconscious it typically remains. We slide between different versions of ourselves without noticing the transition. Moreover, we often mistake the roles we play for our authentic identity. The person who has played the role of the responsible one for decades may never question whether this role truly reflects their deeper nature or was simply adopted to meet others' expectations. This law operates not just at the individual level, but at the societal level as well. Every culture creates what sociologists call scripts, standard patterns of behavior for different situations. Think of the scripted interactions between restaurant servers and customers, the rituals of courtship, or the protocols of professional settings. These scripts reduce social friction, but can also trap us in roles that don't serve our deeper needs. Understanding the law of role-playing doesn't mean we should strive for some impossible, authentic self that transcends all roles. Rather, it invites us to bring greater consciousness to the roles we play. When we recognize that we're performing, we gain the power to adjust our performance, to keep what serves us and others while discarding what doesn't. This awareness also helps us interact more effectively with others. When someone behaves in ways that seem mystifying or contradictory, it helps to remember that they too are playing roles shaped by context and expectation. The aggressive colleague might be playing a role they believe necessary for professional advancement. The emotionally distant partner might be performing a role they learned in childhood to protect themselves from vulnerability. Perhaps most powerfully, understanding this law allows us to experiment with new roles. If you've always played the peacemaker, what happens when you try the role of the truth teller? If you've always been the serious professional, what emerges when you allow yourself to play the creative explorer? Viewing identity as a set of roles we can consciously adopt rather than fixed traits we're stuck with creates remarkable freedom for growth and reinvention. Now let's turn to what might be the most challenging law to accept, what we can call the law of compulsive behavior. This law states that much of what we consider free choice is actually compulsive behavior driven by unconscious forces. We cherish the belief that we freely choose our actions, but psychological research consistently reveals how much of our behavior follows automatic patterns established long before we had the capacity for conscious choice. These patterns, what psychologists sometimes call schema or what neuroscientists refer to as neural pathways, form the invisible architecture of our behavior. Consider how many aspects of your life reflect patterns established in your earliest years. The people you're attracted to often share qualities with your early caregivers. The conflicts that recur in your relationships often mirror dynamics from your family of origin. The emotional triggers that provoke outsized reactions often connect to childhood experiences of vulnerability or threat. These patterns don't just influence our relationships, they shape our careers, our creativity, our approach to money, our relationship with authority, and countless other dimensions of our lives. They represent what psychoanalysts call repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to recreate familiar situations even when they cause suffering. What makes this law particularly unsettling is that these compulsive patterns operate most powerfully precisely when we feel we're making free choices. The person who repeatedly selects romantic partners who treat them poorly doesn't consciously think, "I'll choose someone who will hurt me." They feel genuinely attracted to these individuals without recognizing the unconscious patterns driving that attraction. The law of compulsive behavior doesn't just apply to individuals, it operates at the collective level as well. Nations repeat historical patterns of conflict. Organizations recreate the same dysfunctions across generations of leadership. Social groups cycle through predictable phases of cohesion and fragmentation. At every level, the pull toward the familiar often outweighs the rational pursuit of what would actually serve us better. Understanding this law doesn't mean resigning ourselves to determinism. Rather, it invites us to bring greater consciousness to the patterns that would otherwise control us automatically. As Carl Jung observed, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. In practical terms, acknowledging the law of compulsive behavior means paying careful attention to recurring patterns in your life. When you find yourself in the same problematic situation for the third or fourth time, the question isn't, "Why does this keep happening to me?" but "What role am I playing in recreating this familiar dynamic?" This awareness creates the possibility of what psychologists call pattern interruption, deliberately breaking familiar cycles to create space for new choices. Sometimes even a small deviation from an established pattern can lead to dramatically different outcomes. The person who habitually reacts to criticism with defensive anger might experiment with responding with curiosity instead, potentially transforming the entire dynamic. Perhaps most importantly, understanding this law allows us to be more compassionate toward both ourselves and others. When we recognize how much behavior is driven by unconscious forces rather than deliberate malice, it becomes easier to approach problems with understanding rather than judgment. let's explore another fundamental pattern in human nature, the law of covetousness. This law observes that humans tend to value what they don't have over what they do have, and to desire what others possess simply because others possess it. This tendency manifests in countless ways. Think about how easily we take for granted the remarkable technologies, comforts and freedoms that would have seemed miraculous to our ancestors, while fixating on what we lack. Or consider how a child surrounded by toys will often desperately want whatever toy another child is playing with, losing interest in it as soon as it's acquired. This pattern continues into adulthood in more sophisticated forms. The phenomenon economists call positional goods, things valued primarily because they signal higher status than others, reflects this law in action. The latest luxury items, exclusive experiences and status symbols derive much of their appeal not from their intrinsic qualities, but from their scarcity and the envy they inspire. What makes this law particularly fascinating is its relationship to happiness. Research consistently shows that acquiring what we covet rarely delivers the satisfaction we expect. The new possession or achievement quickly becomes the new normal through a psychological process called hedonic adaptation, and our attention shifts to the next object of desire. The law of covetousness doesn't just shape our relationship to material goods, it influences our career aspirations, relationship choices, and even our sense of self. We often define our ideal selves not by authentic internal standards, but by comparison to others. The result is what psychologists call contingent self-worth, a sense of value that depends on how we measure up rather than arising from within. This law operates not just at the individual level, but at the social level as well. The phenomenon of keeping up with the Joneses reflects how entire communities can become trapped in cycles of competitive consumption. On a global scale, nations define progress largely in terms of catching up to or surpassing other nations, rather than by how well they meet their citizens' needs. Understanding the law of covetousness doesn't mean we should abandon ambition or material enjoyment. Rather, it invites us to examine the motivations behind our desires. Are we pursuing something because it genuinely aligns with our values and would enhance our lives, or are we chasing it primarily because others have it or value it? In practical terms, acknowledging this law means developing the capacity to distinguish between authentic desires that arise from within and mimetic desires that we've absorbed from others. It means practicing gratitude for what we already have rather than fixating on what's missing. And it means recognizing when enough is truly enough, when additional acquisition would bring diminishing returns to our well-being. Perhaps most powerfully, understanding this law allows us to break free from the zero-sum thinking it often encourages. When we define success in terms of having what others don't have, we inevitably create scarcity even amid abundance. Recognizing this pattern allows us to shift toward forms of fulfillment that don't depend on comparison or exclusivity. The paradox of the law of covetousness is that by becoming aware of our tendency to value what we lack over what we have, we gain the capacity to appreciate the remarkable abundance that already exists in our lives. Let's examine another fundamental pattern in human behavior, the law of short-sightedness. This law observes that humans naturally prioritize immediate rewards over long-term benefits, even when this clearly works against our interests. This tendency is encoded in our neurological wiring. Our brain's reward system evolved to help our ancestors survive in environments where the future was highly uncertain. The immediate pleasure of consuming calorie-rich food or the quick rush of finding a mate had clear evolutionary advantages in settings where tomorrow wasn't guaranteed. Today, these same neural pathways lead us to procrastinate on important work for the immediate relief of distraction, to choose the pleasure of impulse purchases over financial security, and to sacrifice health for the momentary enjoyment of unhealthy indulgences. In each case, the present self effectively steals from the future self. What makes this law particularly powerful is how it operates below the threshold of conscious awareness. We don't deliberately choose short-term gratification over long-term well-being. Our brains make this trade-off automatically, and our conscious minds then generate rationalizations for these impulsive choices. The law of short-sightedness doesn't just shape individual behavior, it influences collective decision-making as well. Political systems struggle to address long-term challenges like climate change because the costs are immediate while the benefits accrue to future generations. Organizations sacrifice sustainable growth for quarterly profits. communities deplete natural resources for immediate economic gain. Understanding this law doesn't mean we should deny the importance of present enjoyment. Rather, it invites us to bring greater consciousness to the trade-offs between present and future that we make constantly, often without realizing it. In practical terms, acknowledging the law of short-sightedness means designing environments that help us overcome our natural bias toward immediate gratification. This might involve creating commitment devices that lock in long-term decisions, removing temptations from our environment, or establishing systems that automatically direct resources toward future-oriented goals. It also means practicing what psychologists call future self continuity, the ability to experience a vivid connection with your future self rather than treating that person as a stranger. Research shows that people who can vividly imagine their future selves make more patient financial decisions and take better care of their health. Perhaps most importantly, understanding this law allows us to be more deliberate about how we balance present enjoyment with future well-being. The goal isn't to sacrifice the present entirely for the future that creates a life of perpetual deferral, nor is it to ignore the future for present indulgence that creates a life of preventable suffering. The art lies in finding the middle path where present actions create both immediate satisfaction and future benefit. The paradox of the law of short-sightedness is that by acknowledging our natural bias toward immediate rewards, we gain the capacity to make choices that serve both our present and future selves, creating a life of sustainable fulfillment rather than oscillating between indulgence and regret. Let's explore one final fundamental pattern in human psychology, the law of defensiveness. This law observes that humans instinctively resist information that challenges their existing beliefs or self-image, regardless of how beneficial that information might be. This defensive tendency manifests in countless ways. Think about how difficult it is to accept criticism, even when it's offered constructively. Or consider how we tend to dismiss evidence that contradicts our political or religious views while readily accepting evidence that confirms them. This isn't a failure of intelligence. Studies show that more educated people are often more skilled at defending their existing beliefs rather than more open to changing them. What makes this law particularly powerful is that it operates largely outside our awareness. We don't consciously decide to reject challenging information. Our brains do this automatically through mechanisms like confirmation bias, selectively noticing evidence that supports our existing views, and motivated reasoning, evaluating evidence differently depending on whether it supports or challenges our preferred conclusions. The law of defensiveness doesn't just influence how we process information, it shapes our relationships as well. Defensive reactions often escalate conflicts, as each person becomes increasingly committed to protecting their position, rather than understanding the other's perspective. This dynamic explains why so many disagreements generate more heat than light. Understanding this law doesn't mean we should uncritically accept all criticism or opposing viewpoints. Rather, it invites us to bring greater consciousness to our defensive reactions so we can choose when to protect our existing perspectives and when to open ourselves to new information. In practical terms, acknowledging the law of defensiveness means developing what psychologists call intellectual humility, the awareness that our beliefs are always incomplete and potentially flawed. This quality doesn't require abandoning conviction. It simply means holding even our strongest beliefs with a measure of tentativeness and genuine openness to revision. It also means recognizing defensive reactions when they arise, the tightening in your chest when your ideas are challenged, the rush to counter-argument before fully absorbing what's being said, the subtle ways you might dismiss the messenger to avoid engaging with the message. These physical and emotional signals often precede conscious thought and can serve as early warning systems that defensiveness is activating. Perhaps most powerfully, understanding this law allows us to approach disagreements with genuine curiosity rather than automatic defensiveness. When we recognize that our instinctive resistance to opposing viewpoints reflects our psychology rather than the merits of those viewpoints, we create space for more productive dialogue and genuine learning. The paradox of the law of defensiveness is that by acknowledging our natural resistance to challenging information, we gain the capacity to engage more openly with diverse perspectives, potentially discovering truths that our defensive mechanisms would otherwise keep hidden from us. As we conclude our exploration of the laws of human nature, let's reflect on what these patterns reveal about our shared humanity. While we've examined these laws individually, They actually operate as an interconnected system, constantly interacting and reinforcing each other. Our irrationality fuels our narcissism, which strengthens our role-playing, which enables our compulsive behaviors, which intensifies our covetousness, which exacerbates our short-sightedness, which amplifies our defensiveness. These patterns don't just coexist, they form a complex ecosystem of human psychology. Understanding these laws might initially seem discouraging. Are we really so predictably irrational, self-centered, performative, compulsive, envious, short-sighted, and defensive? The answer is yes, and this recognition is actually the beginning of wisdom rather than the end of hope. For these laws operate with full force precisely when we remain unaware of them. As we develop consciousness of these patterns, we gain the capacity to work with them rather than being unconsciously controlled by them. This is what philosophers and spiritual teachers have called freedom. Not the absence of these tendencies, but the awareness that creates choice in relationship to them. Moreover, understanding these laws of human nature allows us to approach both ourselves and others with greater compassion. When we recognize how universal these patterns are, that they reflect our shared evolutionary heritage rather than individual moral failings, judgment gives way to understanding. We see that the colleague who frustrates us, the family member who puzzles us, and the stranger whose views seem incomprehensible are all navigating the same psychological currents we are, often with no more awareness than we have. Perhaps most importantly, these laws remind us of our profound interconnectedness. Despite our narcissistic tendency to experience ourselves as separate, autonomous individuals, our psychology is fundamentally social and relational. We shape and are shaped by each other in ways that transcend our conscious awareness. So as you move forward from this exploration, I invite you to carry these insights not as abstract concepts, but as practical tools for navigating your life. Notice when your emotions are driving your supposedly rational conclusions. Recognize when your narcissism is creating unnecessary conflict. Observe the roles you play and consider whether they truly serve you. Identify the compulsive patterns that limit your freedom. Question whether what you covet would truly enhance your life. Balance present enjoyment with future well-being, and approach challenging information with curiosity rather than defensiveness. By bringing consciousness to these fundamental laws of human nature, you don't transcend your humanity. You embrace it more fully, and in that embrace lies the possibility of greater wisdom, deeper connections, and a life lived with eyes wide open. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of the laws that unite us all. Until next time, remember, understanding human nature begins with understanding yourself.